I've been shooting with the Canon C50 for almost 4 months now, and I've learned a lot. And in just a few videos I've released about this camera, I've received a ton of questions about it. And in doing some research for this video, I found there were a few other questions that are commonly searched about this camera. So I'm going to be answering all of those questions in this single video for your convenience. Hi, my name is Bruno Pozo. I'm a commercial filmmaker here in Bend, Oregon, and I make weekly videos about filmmaking technique, gear reviews, and how to make money with your camera. If any of that interests you, hit that like and subscribe. Now, on to the questions. I'll be starting with my subscriber questions first, and the first one we have here comes from Patel Mustakim 8386, and they asked for a comparison of the 4K fine and unfine modes on the R5 Mark II, and how does that perform to the C50's 4K video modes. And they also asked if there was a color difference between the C50 and the R5 II. First, let's tackle that sharpness test. When it comes to the fine or oversampled modes on the R5 II, both 24 frames per second and 30 frames per second look about the same compared to the C50. And if we zoom in 200%, I suppose you can give maybe a slight edge to the R5 II, but for normal use, you would not see a difference between the sharpness of these two modes. Now, when you enter the unfine modes, whether that's 24 all the way to 120 frames per second, that's a different story. Even when comparing the R5 II fine to the unfine mode, you can clearly see a drop of sharpness in the unfine mode. The biggest difference between the two cameras is when they shoot 4K 60. The R5 II does not have oversampled 4K 60, but the C50 does. And so looking at them side by side, we can clearly see how much sharper the Canon C50 footage is in 4K 60. So if sharp 4K 60 is important to your videos, then definitely the C50 wins over the R5 Mark II. But both of the cameras do not oversample in 4K 120. And so how do those compare? As you can see, both the images soften up quite a bit compared to their oversampled modes, but here they actually look about the same. You really wouldn't be able to tell the difference between the C50 footage or the R5 Mark II footage. So I'd make this a tie. As for the color differences, I made sure they had the exact same settings, so the same picture profile in C-Log 2, same color matrix, which was neutral in this case, and made sure all the other settings were matching. And then I simply held a color checker in frame, and I used that to get a more scientific difference between each of the colors. But if we are just judging this by eye, there really isn't much of a difference. If anything, I think there might be slightly more magenta in the skin tones on the Canon C50. But now if we look at the vector scope of the color checker, here we can see how the R5 II probably has slightly more red and yellow tones, but otherwise their saturation and range are about the same. So it seems like that magenta shift coming from the C50 just might be how it interprets skin tones compared to the mirrorless lineup. Great question, Patel. Next, we have a question from Flex Fashion Magazine 2585, and they want to see a dynamic range test between the R5 II and the C50. I already did a dynamic range test in my C50 versus R5 Mark II video that you can check out, but I decided to do one more stress test that I actually picked up from Josh Sadden, which is another great creator here on YouTube. Simply, I stand in a dark room by a window and try to expose the scene to preserve the highlights outside the window. And then, in post, I will raise the shadows of the image to see how it holds up and performs. For this test, I shot in raw light on both the C50 and the R5 Mark II, and the C50 has 7K RAW, and the R5 Mark II, I did it in the 8K RAW mode. And here's what I found. Both look great without the shadows lifted. In fact, I think the dynamic range is about the same in terms of the details you're getting in the highlight retention and the shadows. But once you lift the shadows, I do notice the R5 II looks more noisy than the C50. And if we zoom in, we can see that the R5 II has more chroma noise, which is that colored noise pattern, and gives the shadows more of a red tint faded look. The C50 surprisingly holds on to the colors better in the shadows, and you can see that my black sweater stays relatively black compared to the red tint it has on the R5 Mark II. So although in my original dynamic range test, there wasn't much of a difference, I will give a slight edge to the C50 here because of how it retains color better in the shadows, and it does seem a little bit cleaner than the R5 Mark II. Next, we have Blade Realm, who asks about the difference in autofocus performance between the C50, R5 II, and the R1. Well, I don't have the R1 because I rented it when I made all those videos last year, but in that short limited time of using it, that was easily the best autofocus performance I've ever had on a Canon camera. And a close second is the R5 II, but I did feel like the R1 was a lot better judge, especially when things got dark in low light situations, than the R5 II. But you're not going to be disappointed by the R5 II's performance. It has some of the best autofocus processing in a Canon camera. And in third place, it would be the C50. Now, it's not like there's a huge drop in autofocus performance, whether it comes to tracking or anything like that, but I do notice that it can take a little bit longer to focus on what I want, and every now and then, it's been like pretty rare, but there's been a few times where this thing has gotten confused, whereas the R5 II doesn't get quite as confused unless it's a low light situation. And when it comes to subject detection, when using the people mode on both the C50 and the R5 II, I don't really notice a difference. It tracks the eyes perfectly. People stay sharp even if they move in the frame, and I really don't think you're going to be disappointed by the C50. And when it comes to animal tracking, I don't have a long enough lens to track birds with on the C50, but in the limited use I had with my pets, it also seems to work pretty fine. But if you really want the best autofocus performance, I would probably lean towards the R5 II or the R1, especially if you're doing wildlife with birds. The idea of Dream Vision asked, how easy are the C50 codecs to edit? Well, unfortunately, at the time of recording, which is February 12, 2026, Adobe Premiere Pro actually can't read the RAW files from the C50. So I've actually had to convert the RAW files to Apple ProRes using Canon's RAW developer for the C50 files. I looked it up, and Adobe is going to be releasing firmware to handle the RAW footage from the C50, but that is something to be aware of. On the other editing platforms though, like DaVinci Resolve, there hasn't been an issue that I've seen. But when it comes to XFABC and HEVC, honestly, they both perform really well. It just depends on your setup. If you're on Windows, ABC tends to be easier to edit, but will create larger file sizes. If you're on a Mac with one of the silicon chips, definitely the HEVC option edits really smoothly, and you get the benefit of much smaller file sizes. Because I edit on a MacBook Pro, I have found the HEVC files to be perfect and more than enough to edit. And if you want an even easier time editing, you can actually set up the proxy recording up to 60 frames per second on the C50. This is easily my favorite addition of most modern cameras, is having the ability to record proxies internally, bring that into post-production, and have a much easier time editing without having to create proxies in post. All right, now let's move on to the frequently asked questions I found online. How do you format a card on the C50? Well, to format your cards, you go to the menu, you're gonna enter into the recording media setup, and it's the first option here called initialize media. And it works exactly how it does on other Canon cameras. You just select the card you want to format, hit OK, and it will be formatted. Can the Canon C50 do flash photography? Simple answer, no. This does have an electronic hot shoe for connecting devices and the top handle, but it does not allow for triggering flash. And so if you need a camera that does flash, the C50 is not the choice. How do you film RAW on the Canon C50? We'll go back into the menu, and in recording media setup, you go to the second page and it's record format. Here we have the three flavors of RAW: RAW Light, Standard, and HQ. Light is the most compressed, and HQ is the highest quality, least compressed. In this mode, you cannot change the resolution. It will just be at 7K, but you can change the frame rates all the way from 24 to 60 frames per second. How do you save battery life on the Canon C50? Honestly, I haven't really run into any battery issues on the Canon C50. If you record 4K 60 though, I do notice that the battery life timer drops significantly compared to what I'm usually doing, which is 4K 24. So the biggest difference in power consumption really comes from the different formats you are recording in. Outside of that, there isn't too much you can do to help battery life, but here are a few settings you can try. Number one, of course, changing the recording format to something that is easier and less power consuming, like HEVC. You can adjust the LCD luminance to turn it down if you don't need it, and that is in the monitoring setup, first page, and luminance. You can also turn off pre-recording. That will be in the recording media setup, and on the third page rather, there's pre-recording. If you like using that, it's super helpful in events or wildlife, but just know you are going to be draining the battery faster in this mode. So if you want to save some battery, you can switch it to normal. On that note, you can also turn off any second card recording functions, because if you're recording another file, let's say you're in sub recording, that is going to use more power now that your camera is having to record to both cards, especially at those higher qualities. So turning this off can help. You also want to make sure you disable network settings. This is on the network and USB settings menu, and this just prevents the camera from having its Wi-Fi and Bluetooth constantly enabled searching for a signal. And I always turn this off on every single Canon camera I get because I don't really use this feature. And if I did need to connect to my camera wirelessly, I would enable it when I need it. But in all other cases, it is off, and that should help with the battery life just a hair. But once again, these aren't going to change your battery life times dramatically, so do what you can, but the battery life is what it is. How do you shoot open gate on the C50? Back in our recording media page, we are on the first page, and in sensor mode, you will see full frame 3x2. This is the open gate mode. I know on the R6 Mark III, they actually have a menu item called open gate, so it's a lot easier to find, but this is technically what it's also called. Just know that in this mode, your record formats are a bit limited. You only have HEVC and RAW. And in open gate, you can only shoot 24 and 30 frames per second. How do you shoot 4K 120 on the C50? In the recording media setup, it's on page 3. We'll change the recording mode to slow and fast motion. And now we can enter the slow and fast frame rate, and you can select 120 frames per second. Now on the second page, we can change the playback of this video file. So it'll record 120 frames per second, but you can have it automatically slowed down to 20 frames per second, 30 frames per second, or 60 frames per second. I edit in a 24 frames per second timeline, so I set this to 24 frames per second. How do you enable autofocus on the Canon C50? So in the menu, once again, we'll actually set it to the first menu, which is camera setup. And it is the 5th page where we see our autofocus settings. We have continue autofocus and make sure that's enabled. And then simply you're going to choose your autofocus area, which whole area means your whole screen, but you can choose specific zones like small, flexible 1, 2, and 3. And you can move the autofocus zone using the joystick, or if you don't have track by touching priority, by touching the screen. To recenter it, simply press the joystick in. And there you have it. There's your frequently asked questions about the C50. If there is any questions I missed that you want to know about the Canon C50, leave them in the comment section below and I'll do a follow-up video just like this. For now, if you want to see more content on the C50, you can check out my latest C50 video here. Thank you so much for watching all the way until the end. I appreciate every single one of you who do, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.